Welcome back. So we left off the first APUS history video lecture when we were talking about some of these dissenters like Anne Hutchinson, and we were just beginning to get into Roger Williams. So let's jump right in. And by the way, don't forget your extra credit clues, which are the pictures on the slides themselves. So if you can find the clue hidden within the notes that links to what the picture actually is, you get some extra credit points. So, we left off with Roger Williams. So, Roger Williams was a Puritan minister. He had come over from England, and he was located in Salem, and he preached something that was a little bit more radical than the Puritans could even tolerate from Anne Hutchinson, who said that she was hearing voices directly from God. But Roger Williams really challenged not just the theology behind Puritanism, but the practice of Puritanism, specifically in the idea that Native Americans were seen as heathens. So he told his parishioners to believe in something called the liberty of conscience, that they should follow their own beliefs, a set of moral guidelines that were not related to this idea of, heaven and hell and demonstrating that you are a visible saint. So he began to teach that there should be peace between Native Americans and American settlers, the Puritans. He also believed in this wall of separation between church and state. And specifically, he didn't think taxes should support the Puritan church. He didn't think that church membership should be required for voting. I mean, these were really shaking the foundation of the Puritan belief system and the practice of their government. So they said for him to beat it, get out of here. He was banished in 1635. He left in 1636 and eventually went to the region that we know now as Providence and bought land there from the Narragansett Indians to establish his settlement. By 1644, Rhode Island would get a charter and become a colony of its own. And that meant that the people who were squatting there, in order to try and get free land, would get the right to buy land and have it recognized. But there was another problem that was going on in the Puritan church, and that was that after Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams kind of shook the system up a bit, there was really this idea that more and more people who are non-Puritans weren't really lining up in order to become Puritans. They didn't profess themselves to have public confessions and conversions, and so the Puritan church saw themselves facing declining membership. And part of this was due to something known as the Jeremiad, which was this practice of Puritan ministers to kind of pound their pulpits and scream at their parishioners to tell them that they were doomed and there was no way they could save themselves. And that's kind of a downer and didn't really allow people who were non-Puritans to seek to become Puritans. So one of the things that they came up with was a tactic to try and provide some halfway membership, which they called the Halfway Covenant in 1662, which would allow non-Puritans to become Puritans without that public confession. They relaxed some of the conditions. And of course, we know that the Salem witch trials, which were highly written about and publicized, specifically in Arthur Miller's wonderful play called The Crucible, in which he draws a parallel between the Salem witch trials and the communist witch hunt in the 1950s. We see that by having Puritan ministers latch themselves onto these trials, in which they condemned about 20 people to death, 19 which were hanged, and one person who was pressed to death under rocks, that this was a very unpopular public move. And these accusations, which were unfounded except in paranoia, were really a public relations nightmare. And it caused people to turn away from the Puritan faith, and it caused Puritan ministers to lose a lot of credibility. So, where do we go from here? we go to Rhode Island and Connecticut. And your visual clue. So let's start with Rhode Island first. Some basic facts. It was established in 1644, as I mentioned. The First Baptist Church of the United States was established there. Roger Williams was one of their founding legislators, and he helped push through the foundation, freedom of religion, the idea that no person would be required to take oaths of service, that there was no compulsory worship. You wouldn't be like rounded up and sent to church whether you wanted to be there or not. There were no taxes supporting the church, and for a time at least, there was universal manhood suffrage. But later that was changed so that only people who owned property, white men who owned property, would be allowed to vote. And by the way, yes, there was slavery during this period, although not an exceptionally large amount of slavery. Although, as I mentioned in class today, Newport was one of the auction blocks for those slaves. So on to Connecticut, which was founded by Thomas Hooker, who also, like Roger Williams, sought to find some relaxation of the Puritan faith guidelines. There were people who wanted to buy more land than the Massachusetts Bay Colony would allow them to buy, and they were also concerned with the intolerance and religious persecution in the Puritan Church. So they helped found what would later become known as Connecticut. It was actually only 3 towns at the time, but that was enough, Hartford being the first. And a separate colony was formed called New Haven, and New Haven actually was made up of Puritans who actually sided with the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Plantation Colony in order to have a strict Puritan faith-based colony, and that was on the seacoast of Connecticut. And one of the big things that Connecticut does, that of course establishes a foundation for the practices of American government, is the people in their legislature create what is called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It is the first constitution in the United States. Although it allows democracy under the control of the wealthy, it is the foundation of a written constitution, a set of laws that guides and structures the government. And that lays an important precedent for all of the colonies eventually, because establishing a set of laws and a structure of government that was independent from England is seen as kind of risky and a little bit radical, but it is something that creates a unique American identity and starts the foundation of one. So, moving on, we will come to Native Americans. So there are a couple big events. One is the formation of the New England Confederation in 1643. This is actually a loose military alliance between these 4 colonies, that of Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven. And the basic idea is that the people who live in these colonies, the adult men, agree that they will train regularly to form militias, and they will help protect each other as a common collective defense against Native Americans. And that becomes a big issue because in 1636 you see that the idea of collective security is actually enforced. And so in Connecticut you have members from Massachusetts and Connecticut and Plymouth who go to attack the Pequot village. They kill over 400 men, women, and children, especially using a technique by killing non-combatants. They're not looking directly for Native American warriors here. They are setting out to burn and exterminate the Native Americans in their area. In fact, many were sold into slavery in the West Indies for a nice profit, while other Native Americans actually fled. And, you know, this establishes a new precedent because Native Americans aren't really used to this type of warfare, not from the English, because they have no real precedent in this area for that. This changes the structure of warfare for Native Americans, and one person quickly to learn from that is a Native American named Metacom. He was actually the son of Massasoit, who originally established 44 years of peace with the Pilgrims. he forms a Native American alliance throughout most of New England, which is radical in itself. It's kind of unprecedented. And with his oratorical skills and the help of his brother, Wamsetta, who was a spiritual leader, they establish an alliance, a strong alliance of Native American tribes. And it's kind of important to note that although we talk about Native Americans as one group, they are not one group. There are separate and distinct language families, there are separate and distinct cultures, and many of them didn't really even trust one another. In fact, the Mohawk thought that King Philip, or Metacom, as his Native American name was actually seeking more power for himself. And it's a more complex story, but eventually what happens is that the Native Americans do attack 52 out of the 90 towns that are available in their reach. They destroy 13 of them, including some settlements near where I live in New Bedford. In fact, the settlers in this area fled and escaped to a small island in the center of New Bedford Harbor, thinking that it would be more defendable, while the Native Americans burned their homes down. It is actually known as the bloodiest war on New England's soil, even more bloody than the Revolutionary War, which was pretty bad. But Metacom was actually betrayed by some of his closest confidants. The Plymouth Plantation soldiers actually captured him as he was turned in by his own people, and they cut his head off and put it on a pike at the gate of Plymouth Plantation, and there the head stood for 40 years before it eventually decomposed and fell. Pretty gruesome. So, moving on. Let's go to the Dominion of New England, and we'll wrap up some of these notes. So, after the Civil War, Charles II takes control of England, and he seeks to establish more control over the colonies. Specifically, the English crown wanted to create one giant colony from Nova Scotia in Canada all the way down to Delaware, and they would call this the Dominion of New England. They established some ideas that would not be very popular in New England. But it's important to note that back in England, the Puritans had completely lost. They had, by their defeat in the Civil War and the restoration of the crown, it was no longer possible for them to purify the church. So what did the Dominion of New England do? Well, it established an economic principle of mercantilism, and that is that the colonies, their sole purpose was to provide raw materials to the mother country. This would be enforced by passing a series of navigation laws, which basically said that there was no smuggling allowed, no trade with foreign countries, and that there would be a stronger military presence in the colonies. This also meant that the person who was put in charge of the Dominion of New England had a really hard time. He was not liked at all. He banned town meetings, he put restrictions on courts, he taxed people without their direct representation, he banned their legislature, and he said there was no smuggling, so you couldn't make good money selling goods to other countries. This whole Dominion idea collapsed with the Glorious Revolution after James II in England was overthrown, and at the end, Massachusetts and Plymouth were combined. So, what else do we know about the Puritans? Well, they established this principle of perfectionism and hard work, purpose, and mission. They laid the foundation for reform in the country that takes place in other reform movements. We'll see later on. They do establish Harvard University in 1636. They set a precedent that if you had more than 50 families in a town, you had to set up a school. They were the most literate in the area. They had a tight-knit community, very strict and conservative families. They had many children. They lived long lives. And that is the end of the presentation. And so I hope you enjoyed, and I hope this helped. And I'll get your feedback in class. Have a good night.